I had a hard time with Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. Since I got out of my screening yesterday, as of writing this, I have been trying to figure out what about it didn't click with me. I'm a big fan of Christopher Nolan. I've rewatched Tenet the other day to prepare for his latest film, and found myself completely taken by the scope and style and craft of the entire thing, even when the story doesn't make sense whatsoever. Dunkirk is one of the greatest war movies of this century. The Dark Knight is one of the greatest comic book films ever, and I find Interstellar quite overhyped, but still a very, very interesting and good movie. Oppenheimer is realistically my favorite film of this decade so far. So to say I was pretty excited for The Odyssey, especially after hearing it glaze to the eons for its first week of release, is an understatement. Reviews were saying every frame was a masterpiece in and of itself, that it was completely staggering and extremely complex, that it was the perfect follow-up to Oppenheimer and a masterpiece in every way. Now, other than that moment where Tom Holland yells, "Dad!" in the trailer, I had faith that Nolan's newly found cross-cutting, montage, Malick-esque film style he has developed with Jennifer Lame in the editing bay would be the perfect strategy to bring this entire thing to life in the way many people were hyping it up to be. However, I first found the first hour clunky. The movie opens with Travis Scott banging a stick on a table. Okay, how did Travis Scott get into a Christopher Nolan movie? But even once I got past Travis Scott, which actually was not that big of a deal to me, I promise, I'm just making a joke, I found Nolan's complex narrative setup to be jarring and somewhat difficult to follow in terms of trying to figure out what's going to happen next. This is not to say that I always need to be one step ahead of the film, in fact I prefer not to be, but it more so felt as if this film didn't have any pace, any momentum, any directional intrigue to it whatsoever. However, this was a critique that I had heard levied against this film before coming in to see it, and I felt it ticking once we got through that first act. Okay, this is it. This is where he finds his rhythm and where he gets things moving. Oh, wait, what? The pace just, died out completely? Oh, okay. Rinse and repeat that for the rest of the movie. I just want to reiterate here that this was simply my experience with the film personally. I appreciate and respect and enjoy how many people are going to spend 3 hours in a dark room and have their eardrums blown out by a giant loud community experience with Cyclops and gods and Tom Holland yelling, "Dad!" I've spent lots of time sort of ruminating about my film experience and trying to figure out why, at the end of the day, I found The Odyssey to be clunky, uninteresting, and kind of boring. Now, I will say I am not all that familiar with Homer's poem upon which this film is based. I understand it as an important part of literature and understand it as a story upon which many of today's most common stories is drawn, but I didn't have to read it in high school, and other than some experience with Rick Riordan and the world of Percy Jackson, I'm not all that familiar. However, I just couldn't bring myself to possibly believe that the characters in Homer's original were this flat, unconflicted, and simple. The world of mythology and old stories passed down from ancient times all use parable, allegory, and metaphor to get to lessons and distinct feelings that are representative of the human experience and help us tap into understandings of these things by viewing them in other contexts outside of our own lives. So when I got to the end of Nolan's The Odyssey and felt honestly as if I didn't know what it was trying to demonstrate about guilt, family, determination, and other things, I was pretty puzzled, especially coming off of Oppenheimer, which has so much on its mind about the military-industrial complex of the United States, and one of the most complicated inventions in the history of time that continues to plague humanity with fear of total annihilation to this day. I was hoping for something way more viscerally emotional and thought-provoking out of The Odyssey than I got. Nevertheless, my experience didn't seem to be echoed by literally anyone on Earth, so I did some digging and found a completely scathing take on Nolan's representation of The Odyssey by Emily Wilson. Now, who is Emily Wilson? Well, she's a British-American, Yale-educated translator from Oxford whose translation of Homer's The Odyssey was the first translation by a woman into English verse. But the weight of her opinion doesn't stop at the fact that she just knows The Odyssey well. I mean, there are plenty of people seeing this movie who have obsessed over this text over and over and over again, and have tried their hand in translating and setting it in various global cultures and languages. She's also one of the primary translators who Christopher Nolan himself cited as inspiring his adaptation of The Odyssey. Quote, "I think it's the Emily Wilson translation that begins, 'Tell me about a complicated man.' The genius of the character, the cleverness, the inventiveness of him, that was a huge part of what interested me. He's not just a soldier, he's an amazing strategist and a very wily person." I suppose that this quote doesn't totally mean he used Wilson's translation as gospel in his adaptation of The Odyssey, but I was shocked to find out that Wilson's opinion of the final cut of the film was so scathing given Nolan's allusion to her translation having influence over him in his creative process. I found many of these quotes from Wilson actually give me closure on what issues I had with the film in tandem with how they represent what Homer may have been interested in the first place. Quote, "I had hoped that Nolan's affinity with these Homeric themes might push him to new creative heights and enable him to conjure more believable characters. But The Odyssey features his usual combination of grandiosity and superficiality. The film's vision is too confused, its characters too underdeveloped to deliver what it half promises in terms of big ideas, although it is very good at conveying big bangs and big giants." Now, I don't find that Nolan's characters are always underdeveloped, though the women typically are, but this pinpoints to me what was interesting. Many extremely important plot moments from the original are in the film, but completely glaze over in service of trying to build a more traditional filmic structure of heroes and villains. However, Nolan's filmmaking style then cuts to way too many other images and moments within these individual scenes that it not only sacrifices the character building of the character whose moment it completely glazed over, but the character whom the moment was glazed over in order to serve. I have no idea if that made any sense, so here's an example. A great example, no spoilers, is a moment where a very key moment of Penelope's character development is noted, but not made nearly enough of a big deal about so that Antinous can be painted as a greater villain. The problem is, we don't leave the scene having any more disdain for Antinous as an antagonist than we did before the scene began, therefore essentially rendering these 6 minutes of film completely useless and obsolete. This is not the only moment in which I found this to be true, but maybe I was just wanting Nolan to add some elements to a film that weren't in the original text? Maybe my opinion of Nolan's work would grow because it was a fundamental issue with the source rather than his interpretation? However, upon further reading, that suspicion was squashed by this next quote from Emily Wilson. Nolan's Odyssey lacks many of the elements that make the poem great. It has nothing convincing to say about time, memory, history, war, or about the relationship between one warrior's glorious return and the lives of his family, adversaries, comrades, friends, and neighbors. It lacks psychological, emotional, political, and ethical depth. Its narrative structure is gimmicky, the writing is abysmal. None of the characters have convincing motivation for their actions or words. There are no sex scenes, and all the food looks horrible. So here is a scholar who influenced Nolan also saying that the film takes basically all depth out of the original story. This really just further reinforces my original thought, but I would love to actually tie this all back to what feels like the film's fundamental focus and kind of the center of its flaws for me, which Wilson mentions at the end of the previous quote that I showcased. I would even personally push back on this point a little bit myself. I was kind of not convinced by some of the spectacle in this, but I think the film is far more interested in being an adaptation and entrance into the canon of sword and sandal stories than it is actually being an emotionally deep and interesting portrayal of a thousands-year-old story. The Odyssey is the first film ever made to be entirely 100% shot on 70mm IMAX cameras, and I feel like that statistical feat is enough for me to feel as if this film goes to certain lengths to completely sacrifice practicality and storytelling in favor of spectacle and scope. Sure, the attack on Troy and the Trojan horse, the absolute aura farming of Agamemnon as they storm Troy, sailing through the tides of Poseidon and the storms of Zeus, and the returning to Ithaca are well filmed from a "this is big and cool" standpoint, but what are they in service to other than the appeal of seeing big, crazy set pieces on a big screen? I found myself wishing for the majority of the Odyssey's runtime that I was actually watching Robert Eggers' The Northman instead, so I rewatched that film last night and found all of my comparisons completely justified. The characters feel significantly more anguished and conflicted, the emotional arcs feel way more well realized, the feelings of tragedy and heroism live effortlessly together, the film is dark and brutal and uncompromising, and the entire thing serves to heighten the overall mythology of the original Norse stories. I don't even know if I felt that this adaptation of the Odyssey made me feel even more mythical, magical, or interesting to me. It just felt like a big, loud movie. And from an experiential standpoint, that's okay, but from an intriguing, film-going standpoint, it just wasn't enough to sustain my interest for nearly 3 hours. I'm gonna stop there because I have literally written 7 pages on this already and could keep going, but I just needed to spitfire a bit about why I would give Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey a 5 out of 10.